I was on a small rowing boat with a faceless, nameless man. The sun shone down on us as he rowed, and I sat back, trailing my hand in the warm water. I could feel the soft warmth of the sun on my cheeks. I smiled up at the man as the small boat creaked and rocked gently. My hand suddenly began to ache, a dull pain that gradually spread up my arm. The water had become deathly cold, and the man stopped rowing, his face darkening, his mouth yawning wide. Then he began to bellow, a low rumbling sound like a foghorn, his mouth stretched to impossible proportions, unhinging his jaw, and the bellow became deafening. I gasped awake, yelping in pain as I clutched my freezing hand to my chest. The nightlight flickered. I could still hear the foghorn, but accompanied by faint screaming in the distance. It was the emergency siren. I recognized it from the master drill my Aunt Jane and I had attended the day before. The boat lurched, throwing me out of my bunk into a foot of water. I floundered and gasped for air. Pushing my wet hair out of my eyes, I grabbed hold of the large dresser and struggled to my feet. I could taste salt in my mouth. I watched in a stupor as water and objects swirled around me. Bottles, books, clothes, and anything else that wasn't nailed down. I scrambled back up onto my bunk. People were screaming. I could hear them closer now, crying out in blind panic. Men, women, children, a chorus of voices confused and terrified. I heard feet trundle and sloshing past my cabin door. I suddenly felt indescribable fear clutch at my insides, twisting them into a knot of dread. I couldn't move as I listened to the cries. It was as if I was immobilized by our combined terror. Beyond the pandemonium of fearful yells, I heard something else. My mind refused to acknowledge it completely, but it was there, distant, undeniable, the rush of water like a distant roar, and all I could do was stare at the murky waters in my cabin, somehow my foggy brain still refusing to connect the dots. Why was there water in my cabin? Why were people running, screaming? My mind became sluggish and took an age to catch up with events as they were unraveling. Everything was moving too fast, and my brain was slowing it all down into bite-sized chunks of data. Adrenaline was quickly released into my bloodstream, spurring me into action towards my cabin door to join the hysterical, panic-driven exodus. My only lucid thought in that moment as I waded through the water was to run, follow the people. As I made my way towards the door, I could feel the ship listing. I held my arms out on either side of me like a tightrope artist, trying to find my center of balance. I held my breath, silently willing the ship to stop her roll. "We're going over," I thought, as the ship struggled to right herself. I grabbed onto the dresser, feeling the ship losing her battle. Leaning precariously to starboard, she continued to roll, and the sound of faraway crockery, plates, glasses breaking filled the air, adding to the frenzied commotion of screaming people. Items not yet in the water began to slide off the dresser, the nightstand, desk, and any other surfaces that I have not accounted for. My feet began to lose traction, my hands slipping as the ship continued her topple, protesting loudly as machinery and large equipment broke away from their moorings deep within the ship and then crashed through walls, sending a ripple through the wounded vessel. It felt as if she was folding in on herself. I screamed as I heard a loud bang. The ship shuddered, reverberating through my entire body, and then a horrible groaning noise, the screech of tortured metal as bulkheads warped and twisted, and then another jolt. My fingers slipped from the dresser, and I plummeted the length of my cabin. Lights exploded in my head, and I felt my body slip into the cold murkiness. I tentatively opened my eyes. My head hurt. I couldn't see or hear anything, and the combination of auditory and visual deprivation for a moment led me to think I must have died. Only I was freezing and my head hurt like hell, and I was sure cold and pain was not a feeling in death. I reached out cautiously, groping blindly around in my immediate vicinity. I was shivering, and my teeth were chattering like crazy as I tried without success to heave my prone body out of the water I was laying in. I had never felt such unbearable cold before. "Don't panic, don't panic," I whispered over and over again, and then I panicked. "Help!" I screamed. The boat groaned as if in reply to my frantic screams. It was an eerie sound deep in the bowels of the ship. I sobbed as I thrashed around, searching for something to hoist myself up and out of the water. I crawled forward on my hands and knees. Surely something, anything. "Help!" I screamed again and again, pushing unseen debris away from me, my frantically searching hands, now my eyes, reaching out for something to hold on to. Nothing came to hand. I moved slowly forward, feeling my way through the water, pushing aside objects that would float up to me and then bob away to be replaced quickly by more debris. The water was up to my chin, and ever so often as the boat shifted, water would wash over me in small waves. I spat out water, blood, and salt as I felt the wall up ahead. I moved my whole body towards it. Using the wall as leverage, I heaved myself up and onto my feet, leaning my head against the wall for support and comfort before turning slowly and facing the darkened cabin. With my back up against the wall, I tentatively made my way around the perimeter, listening for a reply to my cries for help. Nothing, just the sounds of a dying ship. Every creak, every sound making me jump. A horrific symphony of twisted metal, buckling bulkheads, the thumping of large objects, water forcing doors open, smashing through them, bursting into dry compartments, seeking out the living. Was that the screams of people? Faraway screams? Faint? Or was that the ship screaming in its final throes? The sounds were horrendous and filled me with a fear that I would never have known was possible. I covered my ears. The pitch darkness added to my terror, and I began to scream with the ship. I couldn't stop, and then it was silent, as if it was waiting for something. And I became as silent as the vessel. Perhaps the ensuing silence was far worse. I strained my ears to pick up any sound that would tell me I was still alive. I heard nothing. Nothing but my beating heart. Small comfort as every beat filled me with a sense of time running out. Every beat a second closer, a second gone. I felt as if a countdown had begun. I must have stood there for what seemed an age, waiting. We were sinking, I was sure of it. The ship began to rock ever so gently, and the creaking began again. Would this be my coffin? I thought. Don't be stupid, I chided myself as I continued sidestepping, my hands flat against the wall behind me, feeling my way gingerly at last after what seemed a long time. It might have been seconds. Where the fuck was the door? The cabin wasn't that friggin' big. That had been reserved for my aunt. She had booked the 2-bedroom deluxe family suite with the large balcony. Well, the balcony had been off of her room. I had been allocated the kids' room, large and spacious enough to store her duty-frees and luggage, an adjoining door to her cabin, ensuring I was close by and easily called upon if needed. Another door leading from my room into the main hallway. I was under no illusion that she cared if I was comfortable or not. Everything was set up for her convenience and comfort. It was only the 3rd day of the cruise, and my room was already filling up with her duty-free purchases. My aunt had a thing for a good deal. She must be frantic, I thought, as I searched for the door to my cabin, the door to her cabin. Any door. A horrible thought entered my head. I reached tentatively up above me, and my heart dropped as I felt it, my burgeoning suspicions confirmed. My bunk was suspended above me. My hands felt further along, following the lines of the bunk, the side table. Jesus Christ! We had capsized. My mind went into a kaleidoscope of confusion and panic. One underlying piece of logic fought through the madness. Why was I not dead? Why was my room not underwater? I bent down, trying to catch my breath. I was hyperventilating. I felt dizzy. Calm down, breathe, calm down. Okay, so, the door. I flipped my mind with the room. It wasn't as if the ceilings were that high, if that was the bed. I squeezed my eyes shut, trying to acclimatize myself. Then, this was the direction of the door, I reasoned, examining the virtual map in my head. I stepped forward, water sloshing, objects bumping against my legs. I kept one hand on the wall behind me, reluctant to let it go, my other hand straight out in front of me. Nothing. I took a deep breath and let the wall behind me go, walking straight ahead now, both hands in front of me. How big was this room? My mind screamed. There, I had reached it. I could feel the handle. A thought suddenly occurred to me, and I pulled back. If I opened it, surely water would come flooding in. I let out a yelp of panic as something large nudged my leg. I kicked out at it and it bobbed away. The water was higher, surely. No, it was my imagination. I needed light. I pushed my ear up against the door at the same time, feeling around the edges for any sign of water seeping through. I heard nothing other than the gentle thumping of objects on the other side of the door. Perhaps completely submerged, perhaps floating on top of the water. I didn't know. I couldn't tell. I had no idea with regards to the physics of floating, sinking, halfway suspended objects. How the fuck did I know? I cast my mind back to the countless survival movies and documentaries I had watched over the years. I began tapping on the door. Hollow. Was that a hollow sound? I don't know. How was I supposed to know? I had learned nothing. It was either that, or I just couldn't remember. I felt the throbbing, egg-sized bump on the back of my head. I continued tapping on the door, and only stopped when what must have been a particularly large object bumped up against it from the other side. I took a step back as the image of bodies popped into my head. I stood still, listening as it continued to bump against the door. I turned away, pushing thoughts of bloated, waterlogged corpses out of my mind. I needed light. I waded back through floating debris to where I assumed the dresser was. I remembered seeing a torch in there. It had to be waterproof, or what was the fucking point, I thought. The middle drawer. Reaching up, I wrenched at it. It was jammed. I pulled harder. Jesus Christ! I exclaimed as stuff pelted me. I tried to grab at the falling items. I felt around my feet. My face was almost submerged. I held my breath as I continued to feel around for the torch. I knew it as soon as I felt it. Grabbing it, I stood, gulping for air. I don't know if it was better with or without the light. The sight of my cabin in such disarray, the cold, dark water swirling around me. The light cast a blue hue on the chaos that was once a cozy space where I could get away from June's incessant demands. It didn't seem so big now with the light giving me perspective. Cushions, pillows, bottles of all description bobbed. Bedding floated by, wrapping itself around my legs, making me thrash out in anger, frustration, fear. I turned the torch upwards. It was surreal how the bolted-down furniture seemed to hang suspended in the air. I felt like I was in some horror movie, watching from the outside in, only I was very much on the in. I wanted to turn the torch off just to shut out the nightmare. My mind still struggled to grasp the full magnitude of my situation. I jumped as the siren started up its desperate, lonely call for all hands on deck. Hands that would never heed its mournful wail now. If I could still hear it, then surely parts of the ship, like my cabin, were not completely flooded with water. There must be other people on board, like me, trapped in their rooms. Perhaps air bubbles had formed all over the ship. If we could somehow communicate with each other, that would surely be of some comfort. I began to bang on the cabin wall. The torchlight swung crazily, disorienting me. I switched it off to conserve the battery. Sound carried through water, I was sure of it. It was supposed to be much louder. Not only that, the vibrations, you could feel them. Exhausted and hearing no response, I eventually stopped banging and switched the torch back on. Kicking a bag away from me, I waded through the water towards the cabin window. It was not very big. That had been reserved for my aunt's room. I wondered if she had remembered to shut the balcony doors just this once before going to bed. It was always open when I would dutifully check in on her. I would lock the balcony door and tuck her in, taking the half-empty bottle of alcohol, more often than not clutched in her hand. She would shift in her sleep, muttering some obscenity at me. The torchlight cut through the dark water, dispersing and fading into the depths. My heart began to thump in my chest. I didn't need to look out the window. Our cabin was on sea deck, practically the top floor with the best view money could buy. Capsized, our cabin would now be one of the bottommost floors. Ironically, her money had only served to sign our death warrants. It was unlikely that any rescuers would ever get to us, saving those floors above us, perhaps abandoning all hope for those further down. The first will be last, and the last first, I muttered under my breath. Peering out of the porthole, I thought I could see something, things, out in the depths. I pressed my face up against the glass and squinted. There! Dark shapes, moving ever so slowly. They filtered out of the path of the torchlight, but I saw them. The quick flick of a fin, a tail. They must have heard the ship go down, the screaming, creaking, and groaning of the ship still drawing them in. They were coming for us now, for those whom had survived and for those whom had died. I sank to my knees and began to sob uncontrollably. I couldn't scream anymore. My voice was hoarse, my throat sore. Besides, what was the point of screaming? No one could hear me. Nobody would ever hear me again. I continued to sob, and I thought, why must I exchange one prison for another? I would never again feel the sun on my brow or the wind in my hair. Those simple things we take for granted. I would never hear or see another human being again. It would have been kinder if I had just died when I had knocked myself out. I was going to die in this watery tomb alone, frighteningly aware, listening to a ship's dying moments, thinking of the bodies, possibly just meters away from me, thinking of their agony, their fear, and ultimately pondering my impending, if not imminent, demise. I don't know how long I knelt there in the pool of frigid water. I was freezing. I needed a dry space to hunker down and wait for rescue. I reached tentatively above me and pulled at the dresser. I heard and felt it begin to give as I pulled and shoved at it. It was almost free, apart from one stubborn leg still firmly anchored to the floor. Wasn't that always the way? I wrenched, pulling as hard as I could. I dived out of the way as it came crashing down. I pulled myself up onto the large dresser, shivering as my body tried to regulate its temperature, pulling heat from my extremities to my vital organs. I sat hunched and cross-legged, a damp blanket around my shoulders, arms grasped around my knees, rocking backwards and forwards. I had found some dryish bedding in the built-in wardrobe. I sipped intermittently from a bottle of my aunt's duty-free brandy. I felt warmer as I listened to the sounds of the boat and wondered how long I had been unconscious for. I mean, how long for a boat to sink? I must have been out for over an hour, long enough for people to escape, long enough for people to die. I wondered if June had gotten out. She had gone to bed earlier than I. I had stayed on the deck, looking out over the ocean, mesmerized by the expanse. It was the only time I had peace from the older woman's constant demands. The only time I could think without her nagging voice intruding, complaining, bitching about one thing or another. All my life, from my earliest memory, she had been a constant, telling me how lucky I was that she had taken me in, her sister's child. She would usually remind me of this during the weekly visits to see my mother, who was an inpatient at the local psychiatric hospital. During those visits, she would berate her sister for leaving her with such a responsibility, telling her mad, sad sister that she had robbed her of having a family of her own. I think she took me to see my mother so she could vent her anger and bitterness. It was more for her than I, and when we would get home, she would beat me mercilessly. I think seeing my mother was a trigger. I hated her, not so much for the beatings, but for the way she spoke to my mother. Funny how I don't remember my mother caring for me, only that I loved her, and she was familiar. I never loved my aunt. Some people are impossible to love. She was one of those people. Strange, really, as many children love their abusive parents, or in this instance, carer, if you could call her that. I didn't love her. I hated and feared her. Even now, a grown woman, I feared her. Funny how fear can keep you by someone's side when everything inside you screams to get away. I was her unpaid companion, servant. I waited on her every need, hand and foot. Funny, really, how just as I was getting set to leave her, to break the invisible shackles, just when I had gotten up the courage to leave, finally, then this. Life really was a big bitch. I began to laugh out loud. A big fucking bitch, I mumbled to myself as I opened another miniature bottle of brandy. I never drank, had never touched alcohol before in my life. I knocked it back like a pro, wiping my mouth like I saw the cowboys do in the movies. I probably wasn't ready for the world. I had no friends, no peers, no life to mention. All I learned had been from her and movies and books. I was socially inept. I flung the empty bottle across the cabin and opened another one. This one tasted foul. I spluttered and coughed. I switched on my torch and held up the small bottle to the light. Whiskey? God damn! That was disgusting. I flung that across the cabin and rifled through my haul again. Turning off the torch, I opened a small can of Coke, washing the foul taste out of my mouth. I hoped the bitch was dead. Would be bloody unfair if I died and she somehow survived. I lay back on a semi-dry cushion. I was becoming quite comfortable, I thought. Anywhere could be a palace with the right mindset, I mused as I held up the bottle. If you have enough alcohol. The ship had begun to creak again, a low rumble somewhere. The alcohol had dulled my senses, dulled the fear. The siren was now silent. How long had it taken the Titanic to sink, I thought. Not the strangest of thoughts, considering my circumstances. 2.5 hours, or thereabouts? How deep did it sink? I racked my brain, frowning with concentration. 12,000 feet, maybe more? That can't be right. Really? How many survived? I couldn't remember. I had watched the movie dozens of times, and I couldn't bloody remember. I dozed off, clutching the newly opened bottle of brandy in one hand and the torch in the other. I was startled awake. I don't know what had roused me. There was a faint light coming from outside of the porthole, becoming gradually brighter. I rolled off of the dresser and plopped unceremoniously into the frigid water, staggering towards the porthole, pressing my face up against it. Was I hallucinating? Was I suffering from hypoxia? Was my oxygen-starved brain reaching for the impossible? I could hear banging on my cabin door. I was confused. Turning my torch on with shaky fingers, I trained the light on the cabin door leading to June's cabin. Was that voices? Jesus, they had found me. Help! Yes! I'm in here! I screamed hoarsely at whomever was on the other side of the cabin door. I looked back at the porthole, the light much closer now, brighter. Thunk! A face plastered itself against the glass, looking right at me. I screamed and leapt back. The frogman signaled to me, pointing to himself, then making a wide half circle, then pointing at me. I nodded excitedly. He gave me a thumbs up as another curious face appeared alongside him. They signaled to each other, and then they were gone in a flurry of bubbles. The banging continued on my door. I waded towards the door, kicking aside objects that hindered me. Hello! I screamed. Yes, I am here. I pulled at the door, my numb fingers slipping on the handle. It was stuck. I sobbed and screamed, cursing it. The banging continued on the other side, louder, more urgent. I kicked at the door, banged on it, pleaded with it, and then with all the strength I could muster, I pulled. The door was violently pushed in from the other side, knocking me back and off my feet, and then I saw and heard the wall of water that followed. I stared for what seemed an age, but what actually must have been a second, if that, as the murky depths rushed in at me, engulfing me, and then everything turned upside down. It felt as if I was in a whirlwind being spun around and around. I instinctively swam up towards the floor where a small pocket of air allowed me to gasp for breath. 1, 2, 3 breaths was all I managed, and then the water was covering my mouth, my nose. The torch, which I had somehow managed to hang on to, slipped from my fingers, and I watched as the light slowly descended, and I could see a shadow, a body in my peripheral, floating towards me, its face illuminated by my faint torch light. I instinctively turned towards the corpse and stared into its milky blue eyes, its long brown hair floating above it like a halo, its voluminous white nightgown a death shroud, the skin blotched and white with a map of blue veins crisscrossing its face, neck, and outstretched arms. I screamed, and water rushed into my mouth. The wrinkles around her eyes creased, and her lips twitched in amusement before turning upwards. It suddenly occurred to me that in all the years I had known her, I had never actually seen my aunt smile.